In collaboration with Australian Embassy Thailand, please welcome Ms. Jill Gardner.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jill Garner, and I have the privilege of being Victoria's government architect. Victoria is Australia's second smallest state. It touches the tip of Australia's east coast, and it has a long, sweeping southern coastline. And we have a wealth of diverse regions and attractions like beaches, national parks, wineries, lakes and mountains. And most of these can be reached by a day trip from our capital city of Melbourne. Melbourne is a city which has an intriguing reputation that's emerged out of what can only be called an extraordinary transformation which has taken place over the last 20 to 30 years. So I'm going to talk about this transformation, and I'm going to suggest some of the enablers that have actually allowed this change to occur. I'll just have a little sip of water. So Melbourne is a city that's really busy as well. It plays host to a packed annual program of all sorts of festivals and events. And these bring a huge number of people to our city. So the events include, in January, right now, what's happening is the Australian Open is on for those tennis fans here. In February, we have an amazing festival called White Night, which lights up the city for 24 hours. We have the Formula One Grand Prix that takes place around Albert Park Lake, which is a hop, skip and a jump from the centre of Melbourne. We have a food and wine festival that happens then, and then we also have a fashion festival. In April, we have a comedy festival, which is an internationally renowned festival. From May to September, we have film and writers' festivals. In September, we start our spring racing carnival, and that culminates in the Melbourne Cup in November. In October, we have a Melbourne Festival, which covers music, dance, and the visual arts. And then from November to February, we have incredible talks, workshops, and performance in both the M Pavilion and at the National Gallery of Victoria. We're also acknowledged as being the city where you find Australia's best and most stylish shopping. And we've got a lively passion for eating and drinking. We've got an incredibly strong arts and cultural scene, and it supports a rich schedule of quality exhibitions that come from all over the world. Aboriginal cultural landmarks and landscapes connect Indigenous Australians from southeastern Australia with a living cultural heritage which dates back more than 60,000 years. This is the oldest continuous culture in the world. In incredible contrast to this, following the discovery of gold in Victoria, grand 19th century architecture and city structures that include elegant public gardens became the foundation not just of Melbourne, but also of several of our regional cities. I'm really delighted to have been tasked to showcase Victoria and its design culture on behalf of the Victorian State Government, because as a child, then as a student, then as a practicing architect, and now in my role of government design advisor, I've been really privileged not just to watch, but to actually be part of several decades of change that has taken place in the amazing city that I'm terribly proud to call my home. So first I'm going to introduce you to my role as Victoria's Government Architect, and in so doing, I'll also introduce you to the contribution that my absolutely dedicated team at the Office of the Victorian Government Architect makes to help shape and promote Victoria as a creative state. Of course, I'm speaking to you as an architect, so my narrative is by necessity associated with the design of the built environment, with the buildings, with the landscapes, and with the urban design that we build for our community. There is an often quoted line from Winston Churchill that every architect in the room will know: we shape our buildings and thereafter they shape us. So like many architects, I am a firm believer that our behaviour, our point of view, how we interact with others is greatly shaped by the buildings, by the streets, and by the neighbourhoods that we occupy. Now, the Office of the Victorian Government Architect is located in an important place in Victoria within the Department of Premier and Cabinet. Our role is one that involves advocacy and advice. We've been around for just over a decade now, and in that time, the office has worked really closely and tirelessly with our state government to embed an understanding of the long-term community value that's inherent in achieving better design outcomes across a diverse range of projects. Government is an incredibly large and an incredibly important client of design. And government's built interventions include buildings and places that signify diverse commitments, and they extend, of course, to arts and culture, across sport, health, education, housing and transport. The government architect has been appointed as an independent and iterative voice that reminds government of the value, in the deepest sense of that word, of better design outcomes across all of these project types to help define and confirm Victoria as a place that's not just functional, but it's vibrant, economically thriving, healthy, sustainable, loved by those who choose to live there, a great place to live, and a great place to visit. So it's our message about the value of investment in design that highlights the significant responsibility to make sure that change in our built environment is never dictated purely by economics, but's always overlaid by deep considerations about the quality and the long-term impact of the places that we build, and very real concern for the community for whom we build. So with my message based on promoting the idea of design as legacy, it's worth asking a very important question. What is it that makes Melbourne special? Why has Melbourne been labelled the world's most livable city for the last 7 years? Why has Denmark's urban guru Jan Gehl praised Melbourne's commitment to street vitality and to walkable urbanism? And why has America's urban Bible, Whitney Reader, called Melbourne the hippest city in the Southern Hemisphere? How does this happen? And it's a question that one has to ask. Is it by luck or is it by design? I thought I would take the opportunity to present several, and I've chosen 10, unique and very important moments, I call them, that have taken place both in Melbourne and in larger Victoria. And I've chosen these particular moments because each one, while it's maybe the outcome of perhaps a lucky circumstance, each one has resulted in some sort of design change that's enhanced the experience of place. And this is a fundamental outcome of great urban design. So first up, I'm going to introduce you to Melbourne. Some of my observations have more to do with the shape of the city rather than the shape of its buildings. And the shape of the city has much to do with the capacity of that city to be a backdrop to a creative culture. What does a city need to look like? What does it need to feel like in order to encourage creativity, to enhance engagement, or to promote invention? Acknowledging that strong creative industries are often seen as the key to a dynamic and contemporary metropolis. So, as I've suggested, I've not just watched, but I've grown up as Melbourne has grown up, and I've taken part in that city's several decades of extraordinary change. In the 1960s, I lived with my family in an expanse of single houses in gardens, designed in a pioneering era when we had great new world aspirations for the car. We loved the car. Melbourne has no topography to contain growth. So, because we loved the car, the land area of Melbourne quickly established an unusually extended pattern of suburban localism. Districts with their own characteristics, their own main streets, their own features and their own landscapes. So as a child, I would be put into my very best dress and I'd be taken into town to see the doctor, the dentist, or a theatre performance, or maybe to a special dinner. The city was a place of commerce and business, of specialised services and slightly rarefied entertainment. And I only started to engage far more deeply with the city when I chose to study architecture. In the late 1970s, eons ago, when I started architecture, the School of Architecture at RMIT was in an old, empty factory right in the heart of Melbourne. Space was divided up by scaffolding, and we sat on beanbags. And our lecturers all had beards, very much like they do now. It was very on trend. As all schools of architecture should be, we were in a 24/7 hotbed of argument, critique, and analysis. But we were surrounded by streets that emptied out at 5 o'clock at night, and then they stayed empty from 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon until 9 o'clock on a Monday morning. So I've been immersed in Melbourne's evolution as it's bloomed from that place, a place of constrained 9-to-5 commerce, into a place with a demanding and creative population who are all embedded in a meaningful and rich creative design culture, whether it's in fashion, in food, in literature, arts, or the very unique nature of the city's landscape and its urban and architectural response. So I place great value in the concept of change, with one simple overarching proviso: that change should always be for the better. Much of my time in government is spent in forums where I advocate for quality design outcomes in projects that are changing our built environment. And my advocacy is always overlaid by deep consideration about the quality of place. Watching the continuing growth of Melbourne has made me aware of several city-defining moments in our city's history. And a city-defining moment might be one where a decision will impact the design or the way that we engage with our city. Outside of Melbourne too, as Victoria refines its regional assets, these same types of moments can be identified. Sometimes city-defining change is championed through a brave decision. Sometimes it's a brave individual, a committed single voice. Or sometimes change is affected by an intelligent community who are pushing for reform. Each design moment that I'm going to talk about is on my radar because I believe it demonstrates the inherent value of investment in design. The first important moment in the design of Melbourne happened clearly well before my time, when Melbourne's Cartesian street pattern was laid out in the mid-1800s. The orthogonal grid on the edge of a river is not a unique city plan, and it was set out for commercial reasons, but it has resulted in a beautifully scaled network of large streets, a secondary network of smaller streets, and a distinctive tertiary network of laneways, some of which are open to the sky, and arcades which provide internal through building links. Our laneways have an intimate scale and grain, and they simply feel a good place to be in. While it might be considered a lucky chance that the city inherited a structure that's proven to be the foundation of something unique, we do have government policies that promote things like activated street frontages, the idea of a human scale street wall, protection of scale and grain, the idea of treed streets, and well-designed, generous pavements. All of these things encourage people to walk and encourage people to occupy the street. One of my greatest joys as a university student was weaving my way from Flinders Street Station at the south of the city all the way to the north of the city, never stepping out onto a main street. And every person who has an intimate knowledge of Melbourne and engages with the city has their own special route that they take from south to north or north to south. So over the past 30 years, we've learned to love the unique nature of our streets. In the 90s, a government policy change at last allowed pavement dining, and suddenly our cafe culture exploded. Our tertiary laneways are generally car-free. They're oriented so they capture sun and they're out of the wind. They're intimate, they're busy, and they are uniquely Melbourne. It's not unusual to find a hole in a laneway wall suddenly appears and coffee's offered to passing pedestrians. And these incidental moments are encouraged. Our city grid's surrounded by gardens. They're the lungs of our city, and they're huge, beautifully designed public parks. They're heavily used, they're meticulously maintained, and they, again, are very carefully protected. Melbourne has had a continuous tram service ever since 1884, believe it or not, and it's grown into a unique system that supplies both north-south through the city and east-west trams in a pattern that follows the main grid in the city. By 2007, so by last year, Melbourne had the largest urban tram network in the world. However, if we step back a few years to the 1960s, we see there were heated arguments about our tram system. Like many places in the world at the time, we were loving our cars, and we were building expanded residential suburbs that relied thoroughly on the car. And it was highlighting the difference between the city as a place for commerce and the suburb as a place to live. So after years and years of debate about whether the tram was an agreeable form of public transport, there is an urban memory that recalls Melbourne by about 1970, managing to hold on to its amazing tram system by just one vote. Maybe this was luck, or maybe it was the fierce determination of one particular dedicated individual who was actually within government's transport system. Whatever the circumstance, the outcome was good. Melbourne kept its trams, which have become both iconic and synonymous with the nature and the image of a city. And it aligns too with commitments and policies that now support and promote active transport and preference the pedestrian and public transport over the car. It's of great interest to me that many visiting architects and urban designers comment to me on how unusual it is to see a tram network that actually echoes the street grid in two directions. I think what's important about this story is that sometimes these important city decisions actually are hanging by just one thread. This is a very important moment. The 1970s was a time of significant importance to architecture and in what Melbourne was to become. First, I need to introduce you to Melbourne's Collins Street with its grand Victorian architecture that was built in the 1880s during the gold rush in Victoria. And for one brief moment, Melbourne was the wealthiest city in the world. 1972, we architects have branded this in Melbourne the year of the wrecker. And there was a seminal moment when just one too many of Collins Street's spectacular Victorian buildings was demolished. So a defiant group of Melburnians, which comprised members from the National Trust, the Collins Street Defence Movement, and the construction unions, believe it or not, all rallied together in an attempt to stop the wanton demolition of too many of our heritage buildings. This was actually a community-driven revolution, and it was in full and very exciting swing when I was an architecture student. This moment in our history caused a seminal change in the city, and we started to consider the value in layering our historic city with the new, rather than continuing the wholesale demolition which was so typical in the 1960s. So the awareness of layering our city starts here. The strength of our city grid, together with this recalibrated architectural attitude, not of nostalgia, but of respect for the quality of our architectural past, has managed to provide a rational framework that makes it somehow okay that we now play host to what many critics describe as a layer of crazy and irreverent contemporary buildings, but really our city has become an incredible hybrid, a really exciting hybrid of old and new. I mentioned earlier that several of Victoria's regional cities were established at the same time as Melbourne. So Ballarat, Bendigo, and Geelong share many of the urban design strengths and benefits of the gold rush: wide streets, grand buildings, and the integrated public gardens that go with it. So Victoria is actually quite privileged to have smaller cities, regional cities with valuable and quality built legacy. So like Melbourne, these cities are great canvases for contemporary design. And each is starting to be layered with really wonderful new public buildings. So in Bendigo, we see a busy state-of-the-art hospital that's of a quality that is attracting and holding significant medical talent. We see exciting regional galleries in both Bendigo and Ballarat, and they're of a calibre that is attracting extraordinary exhibitions. And in Geelong, there's an outrageous contemporary library that's brought significant change to the lives of the local disenfranchised youth. And then also in Geelong, we see the skillful reinvention of their waterfront, of their industrial buildings, and there's some great examples of the waterfront campus at Geelong's Deakin University that's reinvented those warehouses. Like many cities in the world, and very much including Bangkok, now that I've been here, Melbourne was set up on the banks of a waterway, which provided transport and access for the city. The Yarra River was essentially an industrial supply corridor for our city. By the time I was at university, industry had moved on, and the river had become an extraordinarily embarrassing back door to Melbourne, remarkably disengaged and generally ignored. So in the 1980s, we were lucky. The vision and drive of two important Melbourne architects changed the city forever when they proposed the potential of the river as a public space. They set about transforming it from a wasteland into a busy, linear pedestrian zone that's now become an essential part of Melbourne's cultural and recreational heart. Their vision set out a strategy for landscaped promenades lined by public buildings, by restaurants, and by open spaces filled with art. Subsequent governments, since the 80s, have continued that vision, and the Yarra River is now an amazing walking experience, and it links really important public buildings and places such as the Melbourne Convention Centre, Hamer Hall and the Arts Precinct, Federation Square, Burrung Ma, through to Tanderrum Bridge to the Melbourne Olympic Park Sports Precinct with its incredible array of quality stadiums, onto the iconic MCG, where Melbourne's dedicated community of sports-mad population watch cricket in summer and Australian rules football in winter. Each precinct actually along the corridor of the river is actually a moment of design excellence, and every project is undertaken with care and consideration of being part of something that's a greater urban whole. That's very important. Now, the next moment, I mentioned the lack of people in the city when I was a student. The most notable emptiness was above the ground floor, where most of our older buildings were completely vacant. Those that were occupied usually contained architecture or graphics students and graduates, fashion designers, artists possibly, people who didn't care too much about fire regulations and accessibility. We were not allowed to sleep in these buildings. So if we missed the last tram home at night, we would actually just have to work all night. There was one coffee shop in Melbourne where we could meet after hours. Out of this incredibly constrained environment emerged some very important design agitators. And in 1990, the City of Melbourne started a groundswell of occupancy change through a program that was called Postcode 3000. By 1992, the city changed a local policy to provide incentives for people to live in the centre of the city. And it resulted in the first wave of converted old buildings and warehouses, the conversion of unoccupied lower grade office buildings, and a whole new vision for city apartments. This was a significant moment in the transformation of Melbourne. The policy transformed our city from a commercial business centre, difficult to occupy after hours, into a residential 24/7 busy place. Enhanced by the city's commitment to plant hundreds of shade trees, to allow pavement dining, and to carry out really important urban design outcomes that encouraged the new residents to occupy the streets, the change in the life of the city over the decade of the 1990s can really be called nothing short of extraordinary. I've touched on that moment when Melbourne's cafe culture exploded. Through my architectural lens, there's a clear link between urban design and food that's emerged out of our commitment to providing urban places that support social connection. Well-planned, delightful food and wine experiences have now become the norm in Melbourne and right across Victoria, rather than the exception. We have annual awards that are dedicated to celebrating innovation and excellence in the design of food premises, retail, etc., all scales and types, from high-end restaurants and bars to beautifully designed cellar door experiences across Victoria's vineyard regions, to those hole-in-the-wall cafes that I mentioned. The explosion of design aspiration, innovation and quality right across Victoria is really extraordinary. With food culture comes food awareness. And a Victorian education program, which was set up by one of our influential chefs, has been really impactful in bringing garden to kitchen knowledge and skill to children at primary school level. So this is a school kitchen garden program, and it educates our children to grow and cook food. And at the same time, by providing kitchen gardens and cooking kitchens at school, provides a place that promotes community interest and input. Now, I made an earlier statement that Melbourne is acknowledged as being the city where you find Australia's best and most stylish fashion, and our annual fashion events support an incredibly talented local design scene. There is no question that Melburnians have a very strong consciousness in the way that they dress. And while I have to admit that fashion's quite outside my realm of hands-on expertise, part of my role is to promote the concept of creative synergies and to support collaboration in all things design. It is interesting that embedded in the idea of design and food is the subtle element of fashion, where local fashion designers have very much become part of the creative team that contributes to the visual identity and the experience of a food or a cultural experience. This is a little outfit for the M Pavilion, which is one of our cultural enterprises I'll talk about in a minute, done by one of our local fashion designers.